Welcome to Short Story Theatre. This is Basil Nightingale speaking. Today's play is based on a chapter in Bill Russo's book, The 85-Year-Old Detective. Rick Bates is the 85-year-old detective. He has recently retired as the police chief of Cape Cod. The famous old sleuth has hired John Charles Weeks to be his biographer. Here now, as recorded by Weeks himself, is the baffling case of the Vanishing Homeless.
I'm John Charles Weeks. Some time ago, I agreed to become the biographer of the old Cape Cod police chief, Rick Bates, who spent 6 decades in law enforcement, and was involved in many high-profile cases in the States. But he was concerned that not enough people knew about his work, so he wants me to puff up his exploits, and make him as big a name as Hopalong Cassidy. Or maybe Sam Spade. A while back the chief called me, and told me to meet him in a sketchy bar called Slugs, on Leftover Main Street in Hyannis, to discuss a case he wants me to document for him. I drove down regular Main Street, and then onto the seedy stretch of road at the end of town. That's home to leftover shops, consignment stores, and third-rate bars. I found the place called Slugs, in an alley behind a pool hall. I went in, and the place was so dark, I had to feel my way to the table where the chief was sitting. I took a rickety seat at the table and said nothing while the chief ordered 2 glasses of some exotic drink called a slippery nipple. He knows I don't drink, but he still ordered 2 drinks. He requested a pair of slippery nipples. When the waitress brought the drinks over, and set one down before him, and the other one down in front of me, he interrupted her.
"Pardon me, miss. My associate does not drink, so I'm going to have one for him. Put them both down in front of me. You know, I didn't start drinking till I was 75, so I'm making up for lost time."
I asked the waitress to bring me a Dr. Pepper, and by the time she brought it to me, Chief Bates had already polished off one slippery nipple, and was halfway through the second glass.
"Oh, miss, would you bring me another slippery nipple, please?" "Well, Weeks, thanks for coming to meet me here at Slugs. You know, we could have worked at my office, but my memory works better when I've had a few professionally crafted slippery nipples. And I love leftover Main Street. No fancy restaurants, no tourist trap stores. Just a bunch of thrift shops and a couple second-rate bars and I guess maybe third-rate bars. That's why they call it leftover Main Street. It's leftover. Well, now, the case I'm going to tell you about today, Weeks, was my biggest case ever. In my 60 years of police work, this was the biggest case. I call it the case of the Vanishing Homeless. But nobody knows about it because it involved vagrants and semi-professional hookers. Nobody really cares about prostitutes, professional or semi-pros. Nobody cares about them or their deaths. And that's why this case never received much notoriety. It all started back in the 1960s when I first became chief. I worked all of Cape Cod from one end to the other, from Provincetown all the way up almost to mainland Massachusetts in the town of Bourne. All 64 miles. But I was based in a little town near Hyannis. Now, as you know, that's the commercial center of Cape Cod. Where we're sitting in Hyannis, it's just like a city. It's larger and has a more diverse population than the rest of the Cape. So that's why it's called the unofficial capital of Cape Cod. And it's much more similar to a city like Boston than it is to the neighboring towns of Yarmouth and Harwich and Dennis. In the summertime, it's not only a destination for thousands of well-off tourists, but also for hundreds of down-on-their-luck homeless people. Of course, We didn't call them homeless back then, Weeks. They were just bums. 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 If they ended up in court, we dressed them up in a fancy name. We called them vagrants. That's what we called them in the courtroom. But they were bums. And being a vagrant back then was a crime. Most of the homeless people in Hyannis congregated around the transportation centers of the bus and the rail companies. They had a camp set up in the woods behind Leftover, Maine. Some people made hovel homes from large boxes. Others had tents. Some had no barrier at all from the elements. They just slept on the bare ground with cardboard for a mattress. They mostly kept to themselves, Weeks, except for panhandling by the Hyannis docks, where the ferries bring the rich tourists in from the mainland, and in front of the bus station, where the tourists aren't quite as well heeled. Other than a fairly rare case of a drunk getting out of hand, these homeless people caused very few problems, and we generally left them alone. The other police chiefs and I had a suspicion, though, that a few vagrants were going missing. But it was a transient community, and usually 90% of the homeless people moved on somewhere else by the fall. Most of them didn't have IDs, they didn't have social security numbers, they didn't have driver's licenses. They were pretty much off the grid, off the system. Every once in a while, the newspapers would run a story about a missing person, but that was rarely followed up. Policing, is a business. And in many respects, it's just like any other business. You have a staff and you have a budget. You allocate your resources according to priority. And looking for a missing bum is always just about the last priority. On Cape Cod, getting up on a ladder and going up on a tree to rescue a taxpayer's cat is far more important work for a police officer than searching for a missing vagrant who doesn't want to be found anyway.
So, Chief, it sounds like you knew that people were going missing, and that perhaps murders were being committed. And you did nothing.
Yes and no. Yes and no, Weeks. Yes, we would make a preliminary investigation and record the case in our files. But no. When we heard of a missing vagrant, we did not mount an active investigation for the simple reason that in the vast majority of these situations, the vagrant was missing simply because he or she moved on to another location. As I mentioned, in winter, probably 90% of the homeless make their way from Hyannis to Florida. Some jump on a freight train. Others hitch rides. Some of them even walk a good part of the way. So the other chiefs and I were pretty sure that a fair number of vagrants were meeting with unpleasant ends. But Weeks, we had no idea how many. And we also felt that if somebody killed a bum, the perpetrator was probably another bum. In southeastern Massachusetts, around Fall River in New Bedford, during the 1980s, there was a serial killer who only murdered prostitutes. About 9 of them, as I recall. And that killer was never brought to justice despite slaying those victims. If those women that were killed were prominent citizens, you can bet your bottom dollar somebody would have been tried and convicted for the killings. It's all about priorities. In the Cape Cod case, I got involved because of a woman. She interested me. So I made the case a priority. The woman was Dorothy Barton. Dorothy Barton, who tried hard not to look beautiful, but she failed.
Stop a second, Chief. You're telling me you only took this case because you were attracted to the woman?
Yes, Weeks, I guess you could say that. You know, I've told you many times before, I'm not a bad guy, but I'm not a good guy either. I guess I'm in the middle sometimes. She was so pretty. She was so sweet looking. I immediately felt sympathy for her and I wanted to please her. I listened to her story and I said I'd push the case. It wasn't about making a move on her, though I would have loved to try it. I'll tell you the truth. I guess you could say I felt like Sir Galahad and she was the Holy Grail. I just felt like I had to do my best for her. Weeks, her tale was tragic. She was the mother of 2 young children. That in itself is a hard job, but it was made much worse by her husband, Jimmy Barton. Jimmy was a bright young guy. He was an auto mechanic with his own gasoline service station. That's what he had when he and Dorothy were married. And they had a beautiful house in Centerville. That's just outside of Hyannis. And they were positioned for a great life until Jim got drafted and sent to that war over there in Southeast Asia. I don't know exactly what happened. Jim was captured, held prisoner for months. He finally escaped and he made his way back to American troops, but he was broken. He was crushed physically and mentally. The government sent him home, and thankfully they gave him 100% disability, which gave Dorothy enough money to take care of the kids in the house. But Jimmy became more distant and withdrawn. Eventually he left home, and he wandered into that homeless camp, that Hyannis homeless camp, just off Leftover, Maine, by the railroad yard. Jimmy felt much less broken when he was in the company of other broken people. He was liked by the homeless group. And on some days, he was fairly clear-headed. On those good days, he would occasionally go back to his wife and children for a day or 2. Dorothy would get him in the bathtub, get him shaved, all cleaned up, and she'd spread out a meal fit for a king for him. For a few hours, and maybe a day, Jimmy was almost normal. But like the werewolf of mythology, when that moon came up, Jimmy's mood would change and he would leave. He'd wander the streets for a time, and then he'd end up back at the homeless camp. And poor Mrs. Barton might not see him again for 4 or 5 weeks. She stuck by him, that girl. She stuck by him. Weeks through it all, she never stopped thinking that the old Jimmy would come back. Now, I myself had been to the homeless place a time or 2, and I had seen Jimmy Barton. You couldn't miss him. Jimmy was well known in the camp. He was tall. He was once a strapping man, almost a giant with thick, curly black hair, blue eyes, almost as large as a cat's eyes. Gave his face the appearance of a lit-up signboard. He was big, but not threatening, and he was popular with all the homeless men and women. He had lost weight, though, after Southeast Asia. He went from probably 260 down to less than 150 on a frame that was probably 6'5", 6'6". I talked to him one time. He came over to me, a wide smile on his face, and he asked me if I was joining the camp, and I laughed and said, "No, I'm here on police business, Jimmy." He was interested in my job and especially my weapon. Now, I've used Glocks for the last couple of decades, but back then I had a Smith & Wesson 38 Special. Barton spoke for a while about his service record. Jimmy proudly told me he qualified for expert marksman. He got the expert marksmanship badge in the Army, and he won the silver badge in competition shooting. That was the only time I saw Jimmy or spoke to him at the homeless camp. I guess it must have been maybe 6 or 7 months before his wife came to my office. Dorothy was concerned because it was winter, almost winter, and Jimmy had not come back for his heavy seasonal clothing as he had promised he would. It had been more than 2 months since he had been home with his family. Dorothy was sure that something was wrong.
Chief Bates, I'm desperate. I've been to the homeless camp 6 times. Jimmy is not there. Nobody will tell me anything. I just know he would not go off to Florida, or anywhere else. I think he's getting better. The last time he was home, he stayed 3 days. And for the most part he was acting like his old self. He even worked in the yard for a bit. He mowed the lawn and did some trimming of hedges. I think something bad has happened. Please go and check for me.
I told Dorothy I'd start on the case the very next day and make a written report to her in a week. Now, I'm no 6-footer like Jimmy Barton, but I did have black curly hair back then, and green eyes that looked like they were scooped out of a swimming pool. So I figured I could go to the homeless camp and win over the female population and possibly get a clue as to what happened. Weeks, there was no detecting involved, no detecting at all. It was just connecting the dots, like I always tell you. Crime detection is as simple as one of those connect the dot games in a children's puzzle book. You start at the first dot, and when you get to the last dot, the case is solved. So, the first dot was at homeless camp. My talks with the lady bums would lead me to the next dot.
Yes, I've got that, Chief. Now what happened when you went to the homeless camp?
Well, Weeks, I figured it was best to go undercover. So I dressed up in dungarees. I guess in some places people might call dungarees blue jeans, but anyway, I put on dungarees. And I had a worn-out shirt, a sports shirt that looked like it could have come from any one of the secondhand stores on Leftover Main, and I drove a private car. I didn't want anyone to be scared off by a police vehicle. I carried a paper bag full of chocolates. I figured that if my green eyes and black curly hair failed to loosen the ladies' tongues, the chocolates would come to the rescue. I walked into the camp and I headed for a blazing fire that was fueled by a bunch of wooden pallets they had taken from behind the newspaper office. Seated on an assortment of rickety old chairs, boxes, and logs around the edge of the fire were 8 women. Steam escaped from the spout of an old blue enamel coffee pot perched on some embers. Hello, ladies. I'm a little lost. I wonder if you can give me some directions.
I'll give you a lot more than that. Come on over here, sweetie.
No. She'll give you the stink and the crabs. You come over here with me, cutie, and I'll take care of you.
Well, Weeks, that first lady was a plump, white-haired old lady wrapped in a tattered blanket that covered 5 or 6 layers of shirts and skirts. And the second woman was a cadaverous, ghostly-looking lady who wore only a short-sleeved shirt, despite the late November chill. Her arms were covered with bruises and needle marks. I nearly lost my breakfast just looking at her. Then a solid-looking woman with a heavy jacket stood up. She had long hair just turning to gray. She was attractive in a rugged kind of a way. She said, "I know who you are, pal. What do you want?" "I only want to talk, nothing more. I'm trying to help Mrs. Barton find her husband, Jimmy. He's that tall, skinny guy with the blue eyes that you ladies like so much." "What's in the bag?" she asked me. "What's in the bag is chocolates for you ladies." "I'll take the bag. Give it over," she said. "Give it over." So I handed it over, and she distributed the candy to the other girls, taking a few for herself. When the bag was empty, she threw it in the fire and looked at me and pointed to a drab tent and began walking. She turned around, curled her finger, and beckoned me to follow her.
Come on inside. My name is Phil. It's short for Philomena. And if you call me that, you're going to have a high voice for the rest of your life. Get it?
I smiled. I had to admire this woman who in the middle of a homeless camp exuded class, brains, and power all at once. So I said to her, "Phil, I got it for sure. I like your style. My name is Rick. Can we talk?"
We've already spoken before, Rick. When you hassled me for telling fortunes without a license at the Scallop Festival in your town, back in July.
"I thought you were familiar, Phil, but I didn't recognize you without all your makeup and your fortune-telling costume."
It's okay, Rick. You didn't book me. You were square with me. And I should have spent the $50 at your town hall to get a license. Next year I will. So what do you want to know?
Mrs. Barton came to my office and asked me to help find her husband. He has disappeared, and she's certain that something bad has happened to him. You knew Jimmy. I'm sure you liked him. Everyone did.
Yes, Rick. I knew him. I don't know what's going on, but I do know who talked to him last. There's a guy who comes here every few weeks to pick up women. He tries to get the best looking and least sickly women to go to a motel with him for the night. He never fails. He flashes $50 bills around. He takes the girl to his hotel, gets her a warm bath and a hot meal, and she's so grateful she will do anything he wants.
So this guy is some sort of a pervert who can't meet girls on the outside, so he picks up vulnerable homeless girls. He's probably a sicko. But I wouldn't bust him for that. He's actually giving the girls a pretty good deal, unless he's getting rough with them.
No. He's not into rough stuff. Just the opposite. He wants them to treat him gentle, and he's gentle with them. He calls them his kitties. He says he loves kitties and likes to take care of them.
Well, Phil, do you think this guy has anything to do with Jimmy's disappearance?
I don't know, Rick. But sometimes. A lot of times, actually. When he brings the girl back the next day, he flashes $100 around and says that if any guy wants to work for a week in his warehouse moving stuff around, they will get $500. He offers $100 in advance. There's usually a dozen guys who want to take him up on the offer. He picks one and off they go. Funny thing is, Rick, I didn't think about it before, but I never saw one of those men come back.
2 nights later, on a Sunday night, I was watching The Ed Sullivan Show. Lou Monte had just finished singing Peppino the Italian Mouse. Just as Lou finished up his song, my telephone rang. I snapped off the TV. It was Phil. She told me the guy came to the camp and he picked up a new girl named Maisie. Phil gave me the name of the motel where the guy goes. She said she wanted to come with me while I checked out the place. I said okay. I hopped in my Crown Vic and headed out to the homeless camp to pick up Phil. Then we drove to the motel, and I was not surprised to see only 3 occupied spaces in the parking lot. It was November, and in November on Cape Cod there are very few tourists. Most of the motels close up from Columbus Day to the following May. So I told Phil, I'm going to snoop around the parking lot a bit and run a check on these license plates. Now, you do me a favor and go in and talk to the clerk. Get the clerk to tell you who's staying there. Find out what rooms they're in. If the guy doesn't want to talk, give him that line about fixing it so that he'll have a soprano voice for the rest of his life. So while Phil went in the motel, I made a quick examination of a Lexus, a BMW, and a box truck. And I determined that the owner of the box truck was the guy that I was looking for. When I went inside, I found that Phil had made a list of the occupants of the 3 rented rooms. Good work, Phil. Now just tell me which room belongs to that truck. She said that the clerk told her a Mr. and Mrs. Johnson arrived in the truck. And I said to Phil, ask the clerk if Mr. Johnson has brown hair, is about 40 years old and about 5.5 feet tall, and weighs close to 400 pounds. The clerk answered for himself, saying that I had indeed described Mr. Johnson. After we were back in the cruiser, Phil asked me how I knew the Johnson guy was a Mr. 5x5, 5 feet tall and 5 feet wide. Phil, I told her, it's just connecting the dots is all. Detective work is just like a kid's connect the dot puzzle. One dot always leads to the next, and the next, and the next. And when you get to the last dot, the case is solved. So there were 2 cars out in the parking lot. They had out-of-state plates. That just left the truck. And the lettering on the truck said Sam's Music and Film Exchange. That store is in my town, and I know the guy. He's gentle enough, but being so heavy, he's pretty scary looking, and he's semi-weird. He sells movies and books. A lot of his stuff is just south of illegal. Girly movies and books and things like that. He's never sold anything outright unlawful, and he always pays his taxes. He keeps up his building, but he's got about 10 cats living in that store. When the customers are browsing, the cats browse right along with them. I deposited $20 with the motel clerk and told him he was a special deputy and he had to call me when Mr. Johnson leaves the motel. He liked that pair of sawbucks that I gave him. But I think even more, he liked being a special deputy. And he guaranteed me he'd call me before his guest even got the truck out of the parking lot. I decided to drive to Sam's place of business. His store is in a large 2-story former shoe machine factory that was closed down in the 1950s. He inherited the building when his father died. It's a big place. And though Sam has a huge amount of stuff inside and is a known hoarder, everything looked orderly. I rode around for about an hour thinking about the case, and then I decided to call on the smartest man I know. His name is Ben, and most people in town think he's dim-witted, but they don't know him. It's shyness. He's huge, a muscular 6-footer. He can bend an iron bar with his hands, but he's too bashful to talk to anybody. I got to know him when my cruiser broke down on desolate Telegraph Road that runs along the dunes on the east side of town. There are no homes on Telegraph Road because a lot of times there's no Telegraph Road. Storms and high wind surges frequently submerge and temporarily obliterate it. Well, the engine of my cruiser suddenly stopped on Telegraph Road, about 2 miles away from the intersection of Depot Street, which is a paved road and a well-traveled byway. Just when I thought I was going to have to make the long walk in the summer heat to a garage, a big, strapping pirate kind of a guy said softly, "You want me to start your car?" He wore only a ragged pair of faded denim shorts. A bleached-out bandana partially covered a tangled mass of reddish-brown hair that looked like it came off a Bob Marley album cover. For the next 30 minutes, he spoke less than a word a minute, and with almost no tools, fixed the ignition problem that had caused the cruiser to come to a dead stop. Over the next few weeks, I visited Ben at his shack that he had made from plastic tarps, and we became friends. Though he was not considered intelligent, I found that he could do just about anything. So I hired him to maintain the police cruisers. He did that to perfection, while also fixing broken locks on cell doors, bulky heating fixtures and cooling units, and anything else in the station that troubled us. By this time, Ben had moved into a rented room in town, and the owner of the rooming house was so grateful to him for the hundreds of repairs he made simply because of his good nature that he gave Ben the room rent-free. "Hey, Ben! Ben! Ben, it's Rick Bates. I've come to take you to the clam shack for a couple of lobsters. You in?" Well, that door opened quicker than a northeaster sweeping down the bay, and it was followed by a bear hug that almost knocked the wind out of me. As we ate, I told Ben about the case. I explained that people have gone missing and may have been killed. I told him how Sam was offering people $500 for a week's work, but those people were never seen again. "I'll go to work for that guy. I'll find out what's going on." "But Ben, it's going to be very dangerous. As soon as anything looks off key, get out of there and come and get me." I dropped Ben off at the homeless camp. Phil promised to speak up for him to help make sure that he was selected for the job. I was worried about Ben, but I was certain that a slow plotter like Sam could never get the best of Ben. Back at the office, I sat waiting. At 6 in the evening, I got the call from Phil. She told me Ben had just left with Sam in the box truck. I went to the town garage, got an unmarked car to stake out Sam's store. It was Saturday night. The business would be closed the next day, Sunday. I had people manning the phone at the station. I had 3 officers with me ready to break in if we heard any trouble. "Well, Mr. Sam, I sure do appreciate this job you're giving me. I'm ready to go. What do you want me to start on?" "Nothing tonight, Ben. Tomorrow we're going to be moving things from the cellar up to the store. Tonight you turn in early and we'll have a nice big breakfast in the morning. All you can eat buffet. How's that sound?" "All I can eat? That sounds sharp. I can't wait." "Okay, downstairs I have a beautiful room set up for you. Come on down, I will show you." Sam walked down the stairs as fast as his huge frame would allow as they headed for the cellar. His cumbersome movements reassured Ben that there was no way he could be harmed by the plodding, gasping fat man. Sam opened a door at the foot of the stairs, revealing a well-appointed room with a twin bed on one wall, a desk and a bookcase covering another wall that also contained a door. There was an easy chair and a coffee table near the desk. A large curtained door was behind the easy chair. The room was neat and clean, but Ben thought it odd there were no rugs on the bare cement floor. He noticed, too, that the floor had a pitch to it, leading to a drain next to a wall that had an oversized door. Sam bid him good night and he left. Ben waited until he was sure Sam was back upstairs. Then he tried the door. It was locked from the outside. He went to the other door. It was covered by thick, black draperies that extended from the floor to the ceiling. He drew apart the curtains, revealing a solid oak door with a small window about the size of a lady's handbag mirror. He peered through and saw that it led to another room that had windows and a door to the outside. The only problem was that the door in his room was secured by 6 iron bars that were planted in the cement floor and were connected to a hardwood ceiling beam. Ben knew that he was a prisoner. He heard a scraping noise that seemed to be coming from behind the door next to the bookcase. By mid-afternoon on Sunday, I had run out of patience. I had expected Ben to break a window or do something so that I could rush in and arrest Sam, but there had been no activity. No one had left the building, and no one had entered it. I called up Judge Francis Lee at his home, and I asked him again for a search warrant to enter the store. Again, he said no. The judge was a friend of Sam's, and he refused to believe that Sam would be involved in the disappearance of anyone. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. I signaled the team to break the door down. The solid oak portal was strong, but our 40-pound steel doorbuster splintered it as if it were made out of toothpicks. I expected that I would have to search for Sam, but to my surprise, he waddled towards the remains of his front door. "What's the meaning of this? What are you doing? What are you doing? You can't do this." I answered him with this. Slapped him across his fat face. It was like slapping a blood-soaked sponge. I gave him another one. Sprays of crimson rocketed out of a dozen eruptions. He fell to the floor and burst into tears. I kept smacking him till my crew pulled me off. "Where's Ben?"
"Easy, Chief. We are gonna have to drag you away from him. He can't talk if you beat him to death. Back off a minute and let us get him sitting down, and then we'll see what he has to say. Here, Sam, take this wet cloth and wipe your face off. Help him up, boys, and sit him in that chair. Sam, I'm Sergeant Bengini. Now listen up. You are going to tell us everything. Start talking."
"It wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything. I gave the guy a job. If anything happened, I can't be held responsible."
Okay, Sam. Calm down. Now tell me, what could have happened to Ben?
"Well, Sergeant Bengini, like I said, I didn't do anything. I gave him a room in the cellar. You guys know I I have a lot of cats.
Ben's not afraid of cats. What are you trying to tell us?
I've told you everything. It's just that one of the cats is a lot bigger than the others. It's a lion. Shoving Benjini aside, I pulled that 400-pound sweaty lump from his chair and pushed him towards the cellar. On the way down the steep stairs, Sam admitted he had been keeping a lion for more than 3 years. He got it as a cub and managed to hide his secret from everyone, including his employees and the tenants in the building. The stairs ended up at a dry, airy cellar lit by large lamps hanging from the ceiling. The space was divided in half by a long corridor with 4 large doors on either side and an overhead door at the end. What's the setup here, Sam? Be quick. What's in all of these rooms? He explained that one side of the building was devoted to the stock of his store and to items that he's collected. The other side of the cellar had 2 bedrooms and a large chamber that could be entered from either of the 2 regular doors or the overhead door. He said the big section is where Kitty is. It's next door to the bedroom that he gave Ben. Ben, it's not my fault. It's my fault. When the big cats are hungry, they need to eat 200 pounds of food every day. Now, Kitty might have pushed his way through that door. Shut up! Shut your mouth. No, don't shut it. Open it one more time. Oh, boy, that was like cuffing an overripe tomato. Teeth and juice are shooting out from his bloody mouth. Get Ben's door open now, and you're going in first, Sam. We'll follow. Well, Sam opened that door. Benjini and I, along with the other 2 uniformed officers, drew our weapons. All 4 of us pushed the fat man aside and then trained our guns on the biggest lion any of us have ever seen. It took us a second to realize the thing was dead, and then another second to spot Ben, who was busy trying to get through the barred door. Ben, are you hurt? No, I'm fine. As soon as that guy locked me in here, I began working on the iron bars. They was in pretty solid, but lucky for me, I had one of them pulled out when that door over there opened up and a big cat came bounding through. I didn't have enough time to be scared or even think. When that lion came at me, I shoved the iron bar down its throat. I guess I hit the thing's brain because it died instantly. Ben, that thing weighed 1,500 pounds at probably 1,000 anyway. You're lucky the momentum didn't kill you. Yeah, Chief, it was just luck. I was right in front of the door, and when I swung around and saw it, I had the iron bar in my hand. That bar's over 6 feet long, sharpened to a point at one end. That end is flat. So when I shoved a point in the lion's mouth, the bar got pushed back to the door, and the door didn't give way. It just allowed the big cat to just eat that iron bar. We learned later from Sam that in the middle of the night he had pushed a button which opened the door, letting the lion into Ben's room. Sam admitted he had done it many times, resulting in human meals for Kitty. Sam told us the lion was a cub that he had stolen on a whim from the circus, which sets up in the field behind his building every summer. He had simply walked into an unlocked cage and took the cub while its mother was performing in the center ring. As it got bigger, the lion required more and more meat. Sam felt that many of the homeless would be better off dead anyway, so he decided each time that he went to meet a homeless woman, he'd bring back a homeless guy to feed the lion. We never got an exact count of how many deaths Sam was responsible for, but we believe he's killed at least 24 people and perhaps double that. We based our findings on small bits of remains, such as teeth and pieces of bone.
Well, folks, that's the case of the vanishing homeless. As told to me, John Charles Weeks. By Cape Cod Police Chief Rick Bates, the 85-year-old detective. After he finished the story, I said, "It's a gruesome case, Chief, but we can't leave it there. You need to tell me what happened to Sam, and what happened to you for the beating you gave him. I imagine his lawyer used that against you." Chief Bates didn't say anything for a minute. He just looked at his recently refilled glass with the slippery nipple inside. He watched as the Bailey's Irish Cream and the Sambuca gently rolled up to touch each other but still stayed separated. Taking a swallow and then smiling, he finally spoke.
I told you, Weeks, I'm not a bad guy. But I'm also not a good guy. I smacked him around pretty good. I did it because I knew he was guilty, because I was mad at him, and because I wanted some fast answers. Weeks, do you know the date of the last execution in the state of Massachusetts?
I do not, but I suspect that it happened during your time as chief.
It did not. The last execution of a convicted murderer in the state of Massachusetts was 1947. I'll tell you this, Weeks, I believe very strongly in the death penalty. And I knew that Sam was not going to get it. I figured the best we would get would be to put him in Walpole prison for life. I also suspected he'd hire a team of high-priced lawyers who would use an insanity defense and get him placed in a mental hospital. But as long as we stopped Sam and got him off the street, I didn't care if he rotted away in Walpole prison or in the Taunton State Mental Hospital. So I made a deal with his lawyers. I told them I would not contest the insanity defense if they didn't bring up the roughhousing. They agreed. Sam was put away for life in a hospital. But his room has got bars on it, and he's institutionalized. It was the best we could do.
The Vanishing Homeless was written especially for short story theatre, and was adapted from a chapter in the book, The 85-Year-Old Detective. The play was produced and directed by Bill Russo, who also appeared as Rick Bates, the Detective. Short story theatre is available for free on all audio platforms, from Audible and Apple, all the way to the end of the alphabet. This is your host Basil Nightingale, asking you to come back again real soon. Won't you?